The NBA Finals are set, and of course, the Phoenix Suns are not there. But what can they learn from this matchup to ensure that next summer they're right back where they want to be, competing for an NBA title? We'll talk about it on today's episode of Locked On Suns.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 5 seasons and a writer at Suns.com and Dime Magazine. Thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen today and every day. After a day off, I am happy to be here. Thank you for finding us on your favorite podcast platform. If you're just listening in, hit subscribe, hit follow, and I'll be back in your feed every day. If you're finding us on YouTube, a big thank you. That is the best way to support the show, to give us a subscribe. So hit that button down below and leave me a comment as well. Tell me what you feel like is the lesson to be learned from this NBA Finals matchup, because it's kind of the two teams that I figured we would see here. But as always, the NBA playoffs gives us a lot of up and down. So Game 7 was not something I was expecting between Golden State and Boston. I can't say the game went the way that I thought it would, and obviously the Warriors even being here is pretty interesting. So let me know what you think, but I want to dive into it myself here because I did a lot of homework for this one, and I'm excited. I'm actually really excited about this Suns offseason, more than I thought I would be when I was watching everybody melt down in Game 7. I'm not going to lie to you. So let's dive right into it. Today's show, guys, brought to you by Rock Auto. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, and all the parts your car will ever need. Visit rockauto.com and tell them Locked On sent you. Okay, so 3 lessons is what I'm going to do here. 3 lessons that the Suns can learn from the Golden State-Boston Finals matchup. All right, lesson 1, and they're going to be pretty simple. Lesson 1, more wings. More wings. So let me just break this one down. It's probably the least complicated one, and you probably already are agreeing with me. You can never have too much perimeter talent in the NBA. And these two teams, the way that they've built their rosters are, maybe the best example that we've had in a long time. Maybe ever in this era, because they don't have, a LeBron or a Kevin Durant or something like that kind of throws everything off. These two teams, maybe Tatum gets there. Maybe we eventually feel like Tatum is that guy. But for the most part, it is just depth of, good to all-star level wing talent. And then, of course, Tatum is a little bit different. So on the Warriors side, you have Andrew Wiggins. You have, obviously, Klay Thompson. And then you have just role players that have really filled out the roster in an incredible way. Otto Porter, who was an awesome signing, and I'm going to talk about the free agency aspect of this in a second. Jordan Poole, who they developed. Even Gary Payton, who's a perimeter sort of wing talent. I guess I wouldn't even say wing necessarily. Just more perimeter talent is really what this lesson is all about for me. Even Andre Iguodala coming back. I don't think he was a humongous difference maker. But again, it just shows the Warriors prioritizing that position. You could even put Jonathan Kuminga, Moses Moody in there. Young players who aren't really in the rotation right now consistently, but still show how much Golden State is emphasizing that spot on the roster. On the perimeter for Boston, you have a little bit less depth, but you obviously have the star talent. So Tatum, Brown, Smart, all 3 of those guys are interchangeable, basically wings, but they can go anywhere from 1 through 4 really defensively, and they can all handle the ball and score for themselves. You obviously have Grant Williams, who is their starting power forward technically, but really to me is another guy. He can defend guards. He can make threes. He can put the ball on the ground. He can cut. He's a perimeter guy, even if he is, technically their starting forward at times, or a closing forward at times. And then Derek White, who they traded for, who can basically, he can guard 1 through 3, really. He can play make. He can shoot, and has fit seamlessly. So I'm going to give you the lesson in each of these segments, and then I'm going to tell you how it relates to the Suns, and then I'm going to tell you what it says about the Suns free agency. So that's the point. You just take a look at the rosters, and it's undeniable that these two squads focused heavily on investing in wing talent, perimeter talent in terms of depth, and at the very top in terms of star talent. Klay Thompson, Andrew Wiggins, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Marcus Smart, Jordan Poole. Those are big-time difference-making players all on the wing. The Suns don't have that. So that's how I kind of pull it into the Suns side of things is it shows, I mean, first and foremost, they already kept Mikal Bridges, but I guess a big pat on the back to James Jones. That was a must. That was an absolute no-brainer that they did that. And that's, a big step in the right direction for this franchise to have that guy locked in long-term and bought into what you're doing as a team. That's an irreplaceable player. And it just reinforces how important Mikal Bridges is. Every single team in the NBA would love to have him, and the Suns do have him. But we also know there's another big option, big choice to be made for the Suns regarding the wing, regarding the perimeter this summer. And that's Cam Johnson. So I think that the way that this relates to the Suns is that it's, in the near term, is that it shows how important it is to keep Cam. I mean, it's pretty impossible to replace him. And that might sound crazy, but you look at the NBA, the top of the NBA, the best teams, everybody has these wings. So it could feel like, well, there's so many of them, they'll be able to get another one. But no, these teams may have wings that they like, but they are doing their absolute best to never let them go. Just like I said with Bridges, right? Most wings are either already locked up to long-term contracts like the Celtics guys are, or they are, and I apologize for my allergies, they are not going to be let go. The Suns part of this is you can't continue to bring 4 or 5 bigs onto the roster every year. I think that's a concrete thing that the Suns need to embrace, right? The Celtics have 3 basically sort of traditional bigs, and even their bigs are pretty versatile, but they only have 3. Tice, Robert Williams, and Al Horford. The Warriors have Looney. They have, that's basically it. They have Draymond, who's not really a traditional big, and then they have Nemanja Bjelica, who's not really a traditional big, and that's it. And then Wiseman. Wiseman is, okay, so it's Wiseman and Looney, basically. And Looney, Wiseman, would have been playing. He's not in the rotation because he's been hurt, and they have a decision to make there. But that's 2 or 3 per team. The Suns brought in Frank Kaminsky, Dario Saric. I understand Dario was hurt, but you could have stretched him out and cut him. You could have tried to dump him onto another team. They didn't do that. Frank Kaminsky, Dario Saric, JaVale McGee, and DeAndre Ayton. So that's a tough thing to do when you know how important wing talent is. And then, of course, they brought Biyombo on. So they had 5 centers at one point before they eventually cut Frank. That's not great roster building in terms of just the preciousness of getting a wing. So signing flyer free agents, and this is, again, how I want to close each of these out. What does it mean for the offseason? What does it mean for free agency? I think we can get into the specifics for the Suns in terms of their options, but signing flyer free agents on the wing can really, really pay off for you. You look up and down the conference finals, not even just the finals. Otto Porter, I talked about Grant Williams. He wasn't a signing. He was a draft pick, but he was a relatively late draft pick that the Celtics took a chance on. Reggie Bullock for the Mavs. Max Strus, who is, a little bit more of a rarity because he was a fringe NBA player who turned into something bigger. But I would even put PJ Tucker in that category from Miami too. They gave him basically the same contract that the Suns gave JaVale McGee, and I think we would all agree that PJ Tucker was much more valuable this postseason than JaVale McGee was. So on the Suns side for the offseason, that's one. Don't be afraid to extend Cam. Tax implications be damned. I think that's undeniable here. You cannot let him go. The only way that you let him leave is if he's traded for a star player. If we're talking about Kevin Durant, if we're talking about Pascal Siakam, if we're talking about, I don't know who, player X that decides he wants out, maybe you say Cam Johnson needs to be in that to get it done, and you do it because star talent is probably the only thing more valuable in the NBA than solid wing depth, right? So, of course, you do it then. And then the other thing is, those value wings. Who do the Suns actually have a chance at? Because all those guys I named have been claimed and are unlikely to be on the move, or it'll take some doing. Some of those guys were, Otto Porter, PJ Tucker, those were on 1-year deals. I believe Reggie Bullock maybe as well, but you can bet that their teams will want to keep them. So who's the guy this year? Who are the guys this season that could become the next Bullock or PJ Tucker or Otto Porter? Well, Nick Batum, who I think we all would have felt like was a big, flyer free agent with the Clippers, but he's now put together 2 straight seasons of solid performance. I don't know if the Clippers will keep him. They don't seem to care about money, but that would be a really high priority for me. Rodney Hood, who quietly played decently well over the last 25, 30 games of the season. And, it's hard to know what he'll be. Is he somebody who can stay on the floor athletically in a playoff series after 2 major injuries? He's only 29, and he's played decently well. Jeremy Lamb, another guy who came back from injury, looks pretty good. Not quite the size you maybe want, but you can't always be picky with this stuff. Pat Connaughton, who I'll bring up again later on, he is feeling more and more to me like a major priority, similar to Batum. Daniel House, who played pretty well for the Jazz. We know the Suns had him in-house at one point before really anybody was here, who's currently in charge, but nevertheless. Kyle Anderson, I think, is one. And then Joe Ingles. After a major injury, I'm not sure what he's going to give you, but I'd feel much better about Joe Ingles at the end of the roster than a Frank Kaminsky or an Abdul Nader. I can say that for sure. So perimeter talent, wing talent, you cannot have enough of it. It should fill your every single waking hour if you are a general manager in the NBA right now. These finals prove it. These conference finals proved it. Everything that the league is telling us right now with how it is operating and what teams are winning is indicating that to us, and it's never been more true. Another thing that's never been more true is you have to take threes. You have to have shooting on your team. That is lesson number 2. I'll get into the numbers. I'll get into the history. This one is really interesting. You guys will want to stay right here for it. But first, today's show brought to you by PrizePicks. We love PrizePicks here on the Locked On Podcast Network because we all are NBA geeks. We are all really sports geeks. You can see I'm literally wearing a Cardinal shirt, and I don't even cover the Cardinals. I'm just a nerd. I'm just a sports nerd. But the bigger problem is that most daily fantasy games suck. They are juiced by bettors or guys who just do it for a living, or they're too hard and complicated. PrizePicks is none of that. Here's the deal. You just pick 2 to 5 players and an over or an under on their projections, and you can win up to 10 times your deposit on any entry. It's just you versus those projections. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. PrizePicks offers safe and fast withdrawals. 2 to 5 players. Any prop you can think of. That's it. Point score, rebounds, steals. You can do mixed sport entries. So you can do hits for the MLB. You can do goals or assists for MLS or NWSL. Can't promise you they have women's sports, unfortunately. But you get the drill. 2 to 5 players, just you versus the odds. It's not a pool. It's not a head-to-head. It's not a league. It's nothing. It's just you over or under. That's it. For a limited time, PrizePicks has an exclusive no-brainer offer for all Locked On listeners. You will get $50 free if a player in your first PrizePicks entry scores a single point, which of course they will, when you use the code NBA. That's right, an exclusive offer for all Locked On listeners who sign up today and use the code NBA if and when a player in your first PrizePicks entry scores a single point. PrizePicks daily fantasy made easy. All right, lesson number 2 of this NBA Finals matchup for the Phoenix Suns is that they have to take more threes. As much as I was so happy about the way that the Suns were winning and how it felt unique and this and that, I think the legacy of the Mavericks series more than, aside from the fact that they just kind of fell apart and Chris Paul looked cooked, the statistical on-court stuff, my lesson more than anything was the Suns blocked themselves out of having a chance in some of those games because Dallas got hot and they didn't have the guns to match them. So I'll get into the Suns side in more detail, but that's where my head is at coming into this. And the stats back it up from this finals matchup. Boston has been second in three-point frequency during these playoffs out of 20 teams, so that includes the play-in teams. Golden State was 6th so far this playoffs. In the regular season, Boston was 9th in three-point frequency, which, in case you missed some of the past shows I've been talking about this or just aren't familiar, three-point frequency It's just how many the proportion of your shots that came from deep, and that's it. That's really all there is to think about. Boston was 9th during the regular season. Golden State was 2nd. Reminder too, because I did a whole thing on what did the conference finalists show us about the priority of getting to the basket, because I think that's another thing where people just watch the Suns and they're like, please get layups. But actually, Boston and Golden State in particular were both bottom 10 in at-rim rate this regular season, which means that the proportion of the shots that they took at the basket were actually in the bottom 10 of the NBA, whereas the proportion they took from three was in the top 10. So it's more important to have the artillery, so to speak, to be able to shoot threes and make them and have great floor spacing than it is to, consistently just attack the basket. Dallas and Miami, actually, during the regular season, were both in the top 12 in three-point rate, too. So if you extend it out to the conference finals, it's even more. Now to the Suns. The Suns were 25th in three-point rate during the regular season, and then they were actually lower. They took even fewer of their total shots coming from deep in the playoffs and fell to 19th out of 20. So they were behind even some of the play-in teams that aren't even that good. I know this is not a stat that indicates being good or bad, but it's pretty crazy to think that they were 19th out of 20, and they're a team that supposedly was supposed to be hanging in there with these other teams at the very top of the NBA who were all top 12 during the regular season. So the numbers show it pretty consistently. I also want to go to the history, okay? So when did teams in the NBA win a championship shooting 1/3 or fewer of their shots as threes? That's what the Suns, they were at 33.1%. So the Lakers in the bubble season, but that was their regular season mark. They actually jumped up in the playoffs, and that was a big part of why they won. Anthony Davis started taking more threes. They got bigger performances out of Caldwell Pope and Danny Green, and they started not playing some of their non-shooters as much, Rondo, etc. And then before that, you have to go back to the 2018 Warriors, which was an outlier again to a degree because Kevin Durant doesn't have to take threes to kill you. Before that, you have to go to 2015, when basically nobody outside of Houston even took that many, and the Cavs or the Spurs won. No, the Warriors won that championship, but nobody really took that many. If you just use the fact that the Suns were bottom 10 in three-point rate and use that as the thing to consider when you're looking at the NBA champion that season, you have to go all the way back to the 2011-2012 Heat to find a title team that took as few threes as the Suns compared to the rest of the league. Another team that was bottom 10 in three-point frequency that won a title. I know the Suns did not win a title, but we all thought they might. So this history shows that the Suns were up against it. I mean, up against modern basketball, basically, plain and simple. Booker actually was the exception here. He took more threes this season than he did last season, and he could continue that trend next year. I think he knew it was a priority. Even in last year's playoffs, we saw him more than anybody else really take more. The closeout game against the Lakers, some of the games against the Clippers, some of the games less so against the Bucks. Booker knew that taking and making those pull-up threes in transition, out of the pick and roll, etc., that all was really helpful. But this season, blowouts against Dallas, like game blowouts, not just game 7 and everything else, throughout these playoffs show that you're putting yourself at a disadvantage if you don't have the power to match other teams' three-point shooting. What does this say about free agency? So that's some stuff about the Suns, the book stuff, this Dallas series. That's, again, where my head was sort of at with this. What does it tell us about free agency? Well, I think confidence is what I really think about. And Monty talked a ton about confidence the day after Game 7 and how he was surprised by how little of it the Suns players had, and when he thought he had empowered them to be comfortable, and they weren't. The Suns did this last summer to a degree, but Landry Shamet, who they went out and got, was one of the exact examples of somebody who did not take those threes, who did not have the confidence. He took less than 2 per game in the playoffs, less than 2 threes per game because he was hesitant and he couldn't earn consistent playing time. So the fact that they went out and got a shooter, by the time it mattered, he wasn't making a difference. He wasn't making an impact. Mikal, his threes have gone down from the regular season to the playoffs in both of the past 2 years. Same with Cam Johnson, although a little bit less so. And also Mikal last season was a little bit less extreme, but also when we saw the Suns losing to the Bucks in games 3 through 6, Mikal was not taking threes. We also saw that against Dallas. I know some of that is going to be if Chris Paul and Devin Booker are playing well and setting him up for those threes, but even though it's all connected, it's still important that you have guys who, even with an ounce of space, are comfortable taking those shots. And they understand that the offense is not going to work unless they're taking those shots. And the Suns shooters have just not done that outside of Book consistently the past 2 years, even when they went to the finals last year. Free agency-wise, this is another spot where I think Batum and Connaughton could really make a difference. And I also just think it's something to think about in your post-Chris Paul, post-Jay Crowder, maybe even post-DeAndre Ayton plans. Shooting has to be the priority at almost every single position. I think it's part of why the Dario Saric absence was underestimated this year. I do think he would have made a difference for this team as just another option. I think having different types of bigs is a big deal. It's why having somebody like Draymond or Al Horford, who at least can move outside the three-point line and still be a threat, is a big deal. I understand Draymond's not a massively good shooter, but you get my point. Let's move to lesson number 3, which is stick with it. I think that the really cool part of these finals is that these teams have such a legacy together. I think that's why people are really going to be interested in these finals, really going to watch them, and I think they're going to be really good games. So let's move into that and what it says about the Suns in just 1 second. First, guys, today's show brought to you by Rock Auto. With so many makes and models out there, and my Lord, there are a ton. Having just bought a car, it's like you can't even trust what the name of a model of a vehicle means at a dealer anymore, because at a car manufacturer anymore, because it could be the hatchback version, it could be this trim, it could be that trim, and all these things require different parts. But Rock Auto simplifies that as much as they possibly can. Basically, all you do at Rock Auto is type in the car that you have, scroll down to the part that you need, hit purchase, and it's at your door within days. They do a great job of making sure that what you're finding is what you are supposed to be getting. You can save time and money, of course. It's on the internet. They've been doing this for 20 years online, which is pretty crazy. 2002 or whatever it was, over 20 years on the internet. Not many companies can say that in the first place. Prices are reliably low. They get you what you need fast. They have everything that you need, most importantly. What else do you want? What else could you need? That is cutting out the absolute worst part of the experience. You don't have to go talk to somebody. You don't have to complain about the pricing and this and that. Rock Auto has it for you. It's going to be cheap. It's going to get to you quickly. So go to rockauto.com right now, see all the parts available for your car or truck, and write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, and all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. Last but not least, stick with it. Lesson number 3 from these NBA finals as it pertains to the Suns. To me, 2 of the absolute coolest stories of these finals are Klay Thompson coming back and basically the Warriors not missing a beat. The last time Klay was healthy for a season, the Warriors made the finals. This year, he's back. They make the finals. And on the other side, you have Al Horford, who up until now was the longest tenured, the record still stands, but he's at least going to get into the finals. The longest tenured player in terms of playoff games played to have never played in a finals game. And now he's going to do that. He also left and came back in the middle of all of that and is still making a massive impact for this team. But that all speaks to continuity. Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green have all been together since 2013. Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, and Marcus Smart have been together since 2018. Not quite as long, I get that, but that's still pretty significant. Brad Stevens and Steve Kerr have both been in charge of these teams. I know Brad Stevens is now the general manager, but even more in charge, you could say now, since 2014. They both were hired that season. And then you're also seeing the impact of all of that hitting for these groups now after a little bit of a down period. Scheme and culture in both places lifting Andrew Wiggins, Jordan Poole, Grant Williams, Robert Williams. The Warriors came back from 2 lottery seasons, retooled, recalibrated with some young talent, and now they're back. And the Celtics, they lost the conference finals twice with this group. They got swept last season, and they're back. The resiliency, the stick-to-itiveness, and also just like the trust in the, I don't want to say process, but the trust in the continuity, in the chemistry, in the fact that you believe in the talent you have, you believe in the culture you've established, and it's going to win out over time if you make smart decisions with all of that stuff in mind. So to me, that's pretty obvious how it relates to the Suns. If you're not catching on now, then I don't know what to tell you. But the Suns core has also been together the same amount as Boston's, which is pretty interesting to think about. They haven't had quite the level of success, having now 3 conference finals with this group. That's pretty impressive. Actually, the Tatum Brown Smart thing, yeah, 2018. I have that right. No, 2017 was when Tatum was drafted. So yeah, that's 5 years. It's a little bit longer than the Suns, but this Suns group though has now lived through 2 playoffs together, which is more than most young cores can say. The Booker, Bridges, Ayton, Jones has been in charge since 2018. He's been around since 2017. Monty's been here since 2019. So yeah, it might sound cliche when James Jones talks about continuity, but the Suns are on their way to having it in greater capacity than most NBA teams have. I mean, that's true in this day and age in the NBA. It's kind of crazy with how young this group still is, and some of those numbers are only the past 3, 4, 5 seasons, but that's a lot, especially Booker. So Booker's been 7 seasons now in Phoenix, and he's one of the longest tenured NBA players with the single franchise because of that. Especially if like Gobert were to leave or Kevin Love were to leave, he starts to climb those leaderboards, which is crazy, but it's true. Team players don't stay like that. Shorter contracts, more player movement, all that stuff. It actually is an advantage the Suns have, even if it may seem cliche or silly. I promise. Take my word for it. So what does it tell us about free agency? Well, one, I think it's at the top of everybody's mind. You have to think long and hard about moving on from DeAndre Ayton. I think, we've all been going crazy with the trades. Obviously, I think if it's something like a Kevin Durant deal or a Damian Lillard or whatever kind of craziness we can cook up in our brains, then you do it. Star talent, again, is the hardest thing to come by in any sport, but especially the NBA, where one player can make such a difference, and you give up basically anything that it takes if it means getting you 10%, 15% closer to a championship. But also, you lose a lot changing out on even one starter. So, the idea of moving on from Ayton for something like I've proposed, like Capella and a pick or something, that unless you absolutely feel like you cannot make it work with DeAndre Ayton anymore, you miss out on a lot getting rid of a piece that's so integral to everything you do, like Ayton, let alone multiple, because, in the craziest version of free agency this season for the Suns, they could move on from Ayton and then they could make a separate deal involving, let's say, Jay Crowder. Then you're moving on from 2 starters. Teams, the Warriors and the Celtics have basically never done that. The Celtics brought in Kemba Walker, the Warriors brought in D'Angelo Russell, but all along they had, 3, 4, 5, 6 players in their rotation who were recognizable, comfortable culture setters, system setters that you didn't get rid of. And the Suns keeping that intact is pretty important. So especially just knowing Chris Paul might need to take a little bit of a back seat, and eventually he won't be around anymore. And then you move on from Crowder and Ayton and all this and that. It's like, hold on, what's our team anymore? That matters. I also think versatility is key, which you make yourself malleable with the same pieces by getting versatile young talent in there as well. I mean, this stuff is hard. I know I'm kind of being like, hey, build a roster perfectly, but this is the stuff that has to be on every general manager's mind. I think that's where fresh blood for these 2 finals teams has really been important. Grant Williams, Andrew Wiggins, Robert Williams, Jordan Poole, all those guys helped the superstar players, the foundation players, maintain their level. And it's a little different because the Celtics and Warriors, the Warriors are a much older team. The Celtics are not, but still those role players are helping Tatum, Brown, Clay, Steph, Draymond rise to the occasion more often than not. It's also part of why I personally am starting to like the idea, if the Suns are going to make moves this summer, which I just have to think they're going to do something relatively big, that getting a pick is pretty intriguing to me. We know the Suns tend to do well when they're just having to scout like veteran, older college role players. That tends to be the best for them. So getting a mid to late first round pick, I feel pretty comfortable if they could nail that and get a player like a Grant Williams or a Jordan Poole, somebody older, somebody who has an established skill set who they could bring in and mold to their program. Helps you replace Crowder or Chris Paul down the line with a young player who can come up and actually learn and be comfortable in their role by the time those older players leave. Lastly, this isn't super related to the sticking with it concept. I just want to throw this in here because it's interesting to me. Out of the 8 conference semifinals teams, so that includes the Suns now, the second round of the playoffs, only 3 of those teams were in the tax. 3 out of 8. So you would feel like, so the Celtics were not, just to say that. Dallas was not. And I want to double check Dallas, actually. Now I'm second guessing myself a little bit. Yeah, the Celtics or the Mavericks were not close. So the Celtics weren't, the Mavs weren't, the Suns weren't, the Heat, the Bucks, and the Warriors were the 3 that were in the tax. The Warriors are an exception to every rule. They are paying they're $40 million into the tax. That bill is in the hundreds of millions of dollars, I'm pretty sure, on top of their salary that they just pay to the rest of the teams effectively. Miami, a little bit of an exception. They tend to be in the tax pretty often. And, they're in a big market. They have a pretty wealthy owner. Oh, no, the Celtics actually, or the Heat were actually not. So it might just be 2. They were $2.1 million, $2.1 million away from it, which is pretty impressive. The Bucks were the other team that I can say for sure were in the tax. And, that's a super max for Giannis, a max for Middleton, and the price of winning a championship and committing to your best player. It's a situation the Suns are going to be facing down soon, maybe potentially as soon as next season, as a way of saying, hey, Devin, we're still trying to win with you. We're not going to cheap out on this. So it's not super related to the continuity thing, but I guess it is related to keeping your team together, which is a byproduct of keeping all of your players. They all get more expensive. That's the undeniable fact of salary caps and sports, is that every player is going to make more and more money as their career goes along, so long as they continue to produce. The Suns players, obviously, we all expect them to do that, especially with how young they are. And the tax is going to be a necessary part of that, but you can win without it. So we just saw that with the Suns this year. They were able to maneuver things around, and they were, the title favorite heading into the playoffs, basically. And, they did it without paying the tax. They could do that again next year, potentially. And I think we would still see them as a title contender. Maybe not the favorite anymore. But yeah, it's something to consider. Very few teams actually go into the tax. I feel like Suns fans, I'm not trying to defend ownership or anything. I think if you want to keep the talent together, then the tax is what you do. But we talk about the tax sometimes like it's just this thing every group does, and every finals contender is no-brainer. They're paying hundreds of millions. It's like that's not really true. And most of the times it's big markets with rich owners. The Clippers are in the tax. I believe the Nets are in the tax. The Warriors, I just said. The Bucks are an exception. The Bucks are closer to the Suns than any of those, big market teams are. So just something to think about. Something I'll talk about much more as the offseason goes along. All right, I'm excited for the finals. I know it's depressing and disappointing that the Suns are not in the finals, but nevertheless, I hope you guys learned a little bit today, and we'll be back the rest of the week. More stuff to talk about, more Ayton trades, probably more news, more lessons. I also want to do an episode eventually on like what actually went wrong in Game 7 or in the Mavericks series in general, and just sort of like empty my brain of like, what do we actually need to be thinking about and replacing and worrying about for this group. But all of that to come. Hit subscribe, hit follow wherever you're listening. Now go make Locked On NBA your second listen to catch up on the finals.